So as we've been going through Exodus, we've begun to see the battle that was going on between Pharaoh and Moses. And actually, it was a battle between Pharaoh and Yahweh. Moses kept proclaiming the message from God that Pharaoh needed to let the Israelites go. They were slaves in Israel and in Egypt, and God wanted them to be set free. As we get into this battle, we're going to see some of the subtleties, and we have begun to see them already, the subtleties between Pharaoh strengthening his heart and Pharaoh hardening his heart. And remember the difference being that when he strengthened his heart, he got courage and was ready to move on. When he hardened his heart, he became stubborn and refused to listen to God. Remember, Pharaoh believes himself to be a god himself. In Egypt, anything he says goes, and he can do anything he wants without any repercussions from anybody. Unless, of course, there is someone more powerful than Pharaoh. But of course, at this point, he doesn't believe there is anybody more powerful than him. So he's going to go through a learning experience. Remember, he thinks that Yahweh is just another one of the gods, a lowercase g God. But there's another subtlety that we're going to focus on more this week. In the battle between Pharaoh and Yahweh, they're launching attacks back and forth at each other. Specifically, God's launching attacks at Egypt. And what we learn about warfare is typically the side that has the best weapons is the side that wins. And there are actually two characteristics of these weapons. They are power and precision. Without both of them, you can't really have an effective warfare. Let me give you some examples. Back when Persia was ruling the world, they had the most powerful army in the world because they used a formation called the phalanx. And that consisted of about 100 men lined up shoulder to shoulder along the front, and 10 to 15 rows of men behind them lined up shoulder to shoulder. And frequently they had long poles sticking out in the front, and this phalanx would just march forward until it reached the enemy, and then whoever had the stronger phalanx was the group that won. Well, with the invention of archery, we find that archers could shoot their bow and arrows a great distance and could in fact defeat a phalanx before it even got close to the enemy. That was precision. So instead of power ruling the day, now precision ruled the day. Well, then came the invention of gunpowder and guns. And we find that rifles could be fired from a greater distance than the arrows because they had more power. So once again, power ruled the day. The problem with the early guns was that they shot a little lead ball, and it was not very accurate. In fact, a crosswind could change the direction of the little ball as it was flying through the air. So came along the invention of rifling. Now, if you don't know what rifling is, it is the groove that's inside the barrel that goes in a twisting fashion. In fact, typically it's 2 or 3 of these grooves as they go through the barrel. That's why it's called a rifle and not a gun. A shotgun has no rifling, because it's not a shot rifle, it's a shotgun. So with rifling, as the bullet goes through the barrel, it is spun very fast, so that it goes straight and true because of the gyroscopic effect of the spinning bullet. So, once again, precision ruled the day. And we can see this on down through the ages in warfare. Even today, with the modern intercontinental ballistic missiles, there's a constant trade-off between power and precision. As we go through the battle between Pharaoh and Yahweh, we'll notice how the precision in some of these plagues was just as important as the power in getting through Pharaoh's defenses. So we're going to start out with the last verse of the previous chapter, chapter 7, and then into chapter 8. 7 full days passed after the Lord had struck the Nile. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go into Pharaoh and say to him, 'Thus says Yahweh, let my people go that they may serve me. But if you refuse to let them go, behold, I will plague all your country with frogs.'" That sounds like a real terrible warning, doesn't it? "The Nile shall swarm with frogs that shall come up into your house and into your bedroom and on your bed and into the house of your servants and your people and into your ovens and your kneading bowls. The frogs shall come up on you and on your people and on all your servants." So we find out from that last verse of the previous chapter that this plague of frogs occurred 7 days after the river was turned to blood. And at this point, Moses and Aaron appeared before Pharaoh again, and they delivered the message. They said, "From God, from Yahweh, let my people go, that they may serve me." But he also gave them a warning. "If you don't, I will plague your country with frogs." Now, frogs were a very common occurrence in Egypt. Most of the populated areas in Egypt were near the Nile River, so there were a lot of frogs around. In fact, the frog was a symbol of worship, nature worship, early in Egypt. They even had one of their gods named Heket, who was a woman with a frog head. I think I knew her when I was in high school. However, the thought of frogs likely didn't produce any fear in Pharaoh's mind. After all, the common frog is timid and naturally avoids interaction with humans. So, obviously, these frogs were a little bit different type of frog. They didn't seem to fear people. And they were everywhere, not just in the river now, they were everywhere. All of the Egyptians would quickly recognize that this was something supernatural, that these were from the gods. But Pharaoh didn't see this coming from the gods. He saw this simply as a parlor trick, and he directed his magicians to do the same thing, which they did, which proved to him that this was not a divine visitation. Verse 5, "And the Lord said to Moses, 'Say to Aaron, stretch out your hand with your staff over the rivers, over the canals, and over the pools, and make frogs come out on the land of Egypt.' So Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. But the magicians did the same by their secret arts, and made frogs come up on the land of Egypt." Now, in this case, we're not specifically told that Pharaoh refused to release the Israelites. But we can infer that from the fact that God did send this plague on them. And as with the turning of the water into blood, Pharaoh's magicians were able to duplicate this plague. But they weren't able to get rid of the frogs. So let's go back to our sanctified imaginations here and imagine the conversation that went on between Pharaoh and his two magicians, Johnnies and Jambries. They said, "As with other tricks, my lord, we counsel you not to fear. This is just another magic trick. We will produce the same effect with our magic." Pharaoh responded, "Well done, you two. You have once again duplicated the sorcery of the Hebrew magicians. Now that you have proven that it's just a magic trick, make the frogs all go away." "Well, we've tried to rid the land of these frogs, my lord, but we are currently unable to. I fear that we will have to just wait until they all die. Look, even the Hebrew magicians won't be able to make them all go away completely." Then Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron and said, "Plead with Yahweh to take away the frogs from me and from my people, and I will let the people go to sacrifice to Yahweh." Moses said to Pharaoh, "Be pleased to command me when I am to plead for you and for your servants and for your people, that the frogs be cut off from you and your houses and left only in the Nile? And he said, tomorrow. So Moses said, be it as you say, and so that you may know that there is no one like Yahweh our God, the frogs shall go away from you and your houses and your servants and your people. They shall be left only in the Nile. Well, this is a plague of nuisance. It wasn't painful, it wasn't deadly, it was just a nuisance. Imagine climbing into bed at night and pulling back the covers and having half a dozen frogs croak at you. and opening the oven to bake your bread, and there's the frogs in there. Or opening the oven to remove the bread. Now, there are historical examples of cities being permanently abandoned because of frog infestation. So it wasn't totally uncommon in Egypt. And since the Egyptian people see Pharaoh not only as their ruler, but as a god, they certainly expected him to get rid of all the frogs for them. And since his own magicians were unable to get rid of the frogs, he became desperate, and he turned to Moses and Aaron. And he said, plead with Yahweh. This is the first time that Pharaoh has given credit to the self-existent God. He is Yahweh. Plead with him for us, will you please? So this is also an indication that Moses has been clear in giving credit to God for everything that happened. Now you can imagine, Moses could have been getting puffed up with each one of these plagues and believing he is really, really powerful, but he recognized where the true power was. Now, in both a respectful act towards Pharaoh, as well as a symbol of how powerful their God is, Moses said to Pharaoh, okay, I'll get rid of your frogs. Yahweh will get rid of your frogs. Tell me when you want it to happen. This was a matter of precision. Now, Pharaoh claimed previously, remember, that he did not know Yahweh when he was first approached by Moses. Now he's becoming intimately familiar, experientially, with God. He's beginning to know Yahweh. Verse 12. So Moses and Aaron went out from Pharaoh, and Moses cried to Yahweh about the frogs as he had agreed with Pharaoh, and Yahweh did according to the word of Moses. The frogs died out in the houses, the courtyards, and the fields, and they gathered them together in heaps, and the land stank. I didn't think that was a proper word, but it truly is. Stink, stank, stunk. Okay. The land stank. It would have stunk, but it stank. But when Pharaoh saw that there was a respite, he hardened his heart and would not listen to them as the Lord had said. So, as Moses and Aaron left Pharaoh, apparently they called out audibly to God. And God got rid of the frogs exactly at the time that Pharaoh had requested. Now, as I said, not only was this a demonstration of Yahweh's power, but it was a demonstration of his precision. Incidentally, the gods of Egypt never were known for precision. In fact, they had no interaction with their subjects. They just lived up there and did their thing. They didn't listen to any of the people down below. The people would offer sacrifices, but they never knew for sure whether the sacrifice was going to accomplish anything, and they certainly couldn't tell the God when something was to happen. So this was very unusual for God to be so precise. And then as the frogs died off, the Egyptians gathered them up and put them into piles, and the rotting, foul smell of dead, rotting frogs filled the land. In fact, imagine how many places there were that frogs were able to somehow get into that the people couldn't get in to clear them out, and those frogs would stink as well. So you can imagine your house smelling like dead frog for some time. I can relate to that. We had a VW bus at one point in our marriage. In fact, I had one earlier on, but that's another story. We had this VW bus, and somehow either a mouse or a rat or a squirrel or something got inside the door panel and died. And we noticed several weeks later that it started to really stink in that car. And we never did figure out where it was. But that smell stayed with us for months and months. Now, the English translation here says that Pharaoh hardened his heart. But as I've been cautioning you ahead of time, that's not always the case. This is translated from the words chizuk halev, which means he strengthened his heart. He didn't get belligerent against God. He just got stronger in his resistance. So let's listen to this possible discussion between Pharaoh and his magicians once again, where Pharaoh says, I'm beginning to lose some confidence in you two. You couldn't get rid of the frogs, but the God of the Hebrews seems to have been able to cause all of them to die off. And Yahweh was able to perform this trick exactly when I asked him to. None of our gods can do that, can they? To which the magicians responded, well, of course, my lord, we should have known that in the heat of the second day, without enough food in all of Egypt to feed the frogs, and with the hot temperature and not being near water, they would naturally die off. This is a demonstration of the power of Heket to kill off those frogs. The fact that it occurred the next day is simply a coincidence. Pharaoh said, I suppose that makes sense. Well, I guess we'll just have to bear down and work a little harder. Surely we aren't going to let this Hebrew God get the better of us, not in our own country. So he didn't get more belligerent. He just got more resolved to continue in the fight. Verse 16. Then the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the earth so it may become gnats in all the land of Egypt. And they did so. Aaron stretched out his hand and his staff and struck the dust of the earth, and there were gnats on man and beast. All the dust of the earth became gnats in all the land of Egypt. The magicians tried by their secret arts to produce gnats, but they could not. So there were gnats on man and beast. Now notice that God did not give Pharaoh any warning about this plague. He just brought it on right on the heels of the previous one. And the Hebrew word translated gnats is kenim, which can mean gnats or lice. It's been described by one ancient historian as a species of gnats very troublesome on account of their stinging, found in the marshy districts of Egypt. Now we think of gnats as like little fruit flies, just little tiny flies, and they don't bother us except they're always around the food where we are. They don't sting. Now others say that this gnat was so small as to be hardly visible to the eye, but with a sting which causes a most painful irritation of the skin. They even creep into the eye and the nose. Imagine waking up in the morning and Still others have described this creature as having wings and flying in the air, but so subtle and minute as to escape the eye, unless very sharp-sighted. But when it lights upon a body, it stings most bitterly, so that a man cannot see what he cannot see flying. He feels stinging. Boy, talk about torture, huh? So this insect was a constant source of annoyance to the Egyptians. Obviously, this was a plague of power. If these insects were so small they could hardly be seen, yet their stinging was so grievous, they would strike fear into the heart of everyone who was stung by them, not knowing when the next painful sting was coming. At least with a bee, you see them buzzing around or you hear them buzzing, and you frequently can swat them away before they get you. Well, sometimes you can. With these little gnats, they didn't even know they were coming, and all of a sudden, sting. Now, unlike the previous two plagues, the magicians couldn't duplicate this. Verse 19, then the magicians said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." Literally, they said Elohim, which means gods. "This is the finger of the gods." But Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them as Yahweh had said. Okay, let's go back to our imaginations and listen to this conversation between Pharaoh and his magicians. Pharaoh says, "These bugs are terrible. You can hardly see these little things, but their bite is very painful. What are you two going to do about this?" To which they replied, "We've tried, my lord. First we tried to duplicate the plague, but we were unable to. Then we tried to get rid of them, but even with our strongest magic, neither can we duplicate this trick, nor can we get rid of them. But don't worry, my lord. This is not the work of the Hebrew God. This is truly the finger of our gods. We're sure that if we can figure out the proper sacrifice, we can get rid of these pesky things." To which Pharaoh may have responded, "Look, you two, you have lost faith, and I've lost faith in you. This can't be from our gods, otherwise you would be able to duplicate it. I'm through listening to you two. Leave me. I guess that I will just have to try harder to outwit these Hebrews and their little god all by myself." Now, we know that the magicians recognized that this plague was due to a higher power, but they attributed it to their own gods. And they weren't willing to admit that Moses and Aaron were more capable than they were. But apparently Pharaoh was not convinced that they were doing what they should. So, like with the first plague, we see that Pharaoh's heart became strengthened, not hardened. He encouraged himself to stay in the battle, and apparently he didn't believe this was from the gods. As a result, he lost confidence in his own magicians. Now consider this. When you lose confidence in your most trusted advisors, you are suddenly walking on very thin ice. You have no advisors then. And even though Pharaoh and his magicians were trying to figure out where this plague came from, Yahweh knew where it came from. Moses knew where it came from. Not only had God planned this ahead of time and communicated it to Moses, he was executing his plan one step after the other, just perfectly. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Rise up early in the morning and present yourself to Pharaoh as he goes out to the water, and say to him," now apparently every day or on certain days Pharaoh went down to the river to either perform some ceremonial sacrifice or to wash or whatever. Thus shall you say to him, "Thus says the Lord, let my people go that they may serve me, or else I will, if you will not let my people go, behold, I will send swarms of flies on you and your servants and your people and into your houses, and the houses of the Egyptians shall be filled with swarms of flies, and also the ground on which they stand. But on that day I will set apart the land of Goshen, where my people dwell, so that no swarms of flies shall be there, that you may know that I am Yahweh in the midst of the earth. Thus I will put a division between my people and your people. Tomorrow this sign will happen." Now, first of all, the word translated swarms is arob, which, according to Gesenius, who was one of the greatest Hebrew scholars of the 19th century, this refers to a species of fly or gadfly. It's very troublesome to persons so called from sucking blood, like a mosquito. So this may not be a sting, but it's still going to be a very gruesome thing. Now, others adopt the notion that this referred to a species of beetles. Now, anytime you think of Egypt, you probably also think of the scarab beetle. The scarab was actually believed to be the sun god. His name was Khepri, and he was represented by this beetle. Now, these beetles in Egypt that represent Khepri were typically about 4 inches long. They're not the little tiny beetles that we think of today, which incidentally, if you ever squash one, oh, do they stink? Now, others claim that it just referred to any group of animals. To me, the thing that makes the most sense here is a species of fly just swarming around. This was not a plague of power. This was a plague of precision, because not only did God say it would start tomorrow, but he said the land of Goshen would be spared from it. The Israelites would not have to suffer through these flies. But consider this. On the previous plagues, the turning of water to blood, the plague of frogs dying and stinking and getting into everything, and the plague of the painful stinging gnats were all experienced by the Israelites. We sometimes forget that they went through these first 3 plagues too. And imagine how they felt towards Moses at that point. First of all, he made them work harder, and now they're going through the same suffering as the Egyptians. It's like, Moses, what's the deal? Do you think they murmured against Moses and Aaron? They were about to gain intimate, experiential knowledge of their God, and in the end, they would be grateful. One has to admire Moses' faith and fortitude in the face of what surely was the grumbling of the Israelites. Verse 24. And the Lord did so. There came great swarms of flies into the house of Pharaoh and into his servants' houses. Throughout all the land of Egypt, the land was ruined by swarms of flies. Then Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron and said, "Go, sacrifice to your God within the land." But Moses said, "It would not be right to do so, for the offerings we shall sacrifice to the Lord our God are an abomination to the Egyptians. If we sacrifice offerings abominable to the Egyptians before their eyes, will they not stone us? We must go 3 days' journey into the wilderness and sacrifice to the Lord our God, just as he tells us to do." Now, this plague again happened without any action from Moses or Aaron. It would serve as a reminder to Moses and Aaron that they were not the ones in charge, because they didn't do anything to cause this plague. Yahweh was the one in charge. And in response, Pharaoh finally agreed to let the people go sacrifice. But he said they had to stay in Egypt. You can't go outside of Egypt. And Moses said, "Look, for a couple reasons, we've got to leave Egypt. We don't want to be an abomination to your people, and God has told us to go 3 days into the wilderness." So Pharaoh said, "I'll let you go to the sacrifice to Yahweh your God in the wilderness, only you must not go very far away." You see, Pharaoh is a negotiator. Not a very good one, because he keeps giving up more and more ground, but he's a negotiator. Then Moses said, "I'm going out from you, and I will plead to the Lord that the swarms of flies may depart from Pharaoh and from his servants and from his people tomorrow. Only let not Pharaoh cheat again by not letting the people go to sacrifice to the Lord." So we see that this plague was a plague of precision in 3 different ways. First of all, Moses said when it would start, and that's when it started. Secondly, Moses said it would not affect the people in the land of Goshen, and it didn't. And thirdly, Moses said when it would stop, and it stopped at that time. So Moses went out from Pharaoh and prayed to the Lord, and the Lord did as Moses asked and removed the swarms of flies from Pharaoh, from his servants, and from his people. Not one remained. Boy, sometimes I wish we could get rid of flies like that so that not one remained. I was in the kitchen the other day, and I spent half an hour with a towel trying to swat this fly everywhere it went. That's another story. But Pharaoh hardened his heart this time and did not let the people go. So once again, we see Moses intercede for the people of Egypt, and God responded by removing the swarms. But once Pharaoh saw the plague had been removed, he hardened his own heart and would not let the Israelites go into the wilderness to sacrifice. Wait, Pastor, you said he strengthened his heart, right? No, actually, this time the text says that he hardened his heart. Can't you just imagine him muttering to himself as Moses and Aaron left? Put the foot on my neck. Get out of here, you guys. So what? We, like Pharaoh, are often brought to our knees before the Lord as a result of difficult situations in our lives. And at these times, we're often inclined to make promises. I will change this way, Lord. I will quit doing such and such, Lord. I'll do whatever you want, Lord. But these promises are often ignored or forgotten completely when the calamity is past. Now, as we saw in the previous chapter, Moses has learned to submit his own will to that of Yahweh. He's filled with courage and conviction and is not disturbed by apparent setbacks. He just continues on trusting in the Lord. Pharaoh, on the other hand, is not submitted to God. He's self-assured, self-centered, and believing that he is the ultimate ruler of everything that happens in Egypt. As a result, not only does Pharaoh miss the blessings of God, but he becomes a partaker of the chastening plagues. He refuses to admit the truth and tenaciously clings to his false reality. Are you suffering from difficulties and hardships right now? Now, I know I've been asking the same question at the end of each message for the last 3 or 4 weeks. Why do I keep doing that? Because I think I know the answer. If you're a genuine Christian, then I suspect the answer is a resounding yes. We're all going through difficulties. That's how God builds our faith, by putting us through difficult times and showing us how much he takes care of us. Well, perhaps what you're going through right now doesn't really hurt that much, but is just an annoyance. Constantly being an irritation, sort of like the croaking of frogs or the buzzing of flies. Are you listening to God, or are you resisting? Like Pharaoh, if you continue to resist the gentle prodding of the Holy Spirit, you will gradually become insensitive to the prodding. If you're a true child of God and you're outside his will, then when his prodding doesn't work, his chastening will come. And as you refuse to yield and harden your own heart, things won't get any better. Let me challenge you to assess your situation right now. Trust me, I'm preaching to myself right now too. Do you have the peace of God that passes all understanding, even in the midst of these trials? I didn't ask if you have comfort. I asked if you have peace. For you can have the peace of God even in the midst of suffering. But if you don't have peace, then you're not submitted to God's will. You're resisting the prodding or the chastening that comes directly from the one who loves you more than anyone. Quit denying the truth. Quit trying to be in control. Instead, fall at the feet of your loving Heavenly Father and confess your sinful selfishness. Submit to him and seek his direction for your life. Then follow his direction. Don't make promises while the flies are buzzing around you that you will forget as soon as they're gone. Instead of praying for relief, do as both James and Peter advise us. Here's what James says. But he gives more grace. Therefore it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit yourselves, therefore, to God. Resist the devil and he'll flee from you. Draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Humble yourselves before the Lord and he will exalt you. And what Peter says is very familiar. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all of your anxieties on him, because he cares for you. So, let us all humble ourselves right now. Let's get our hearts right with God and quit swatting flies. Let's pray.